During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some methods were so effective, so quietly powerful, that soldiers were ordered to keep them secret, hidden even from their own comrades. These weren't flashy weapons or high-tech gadgets. Instead, they were ingenious ways to stay warm when frostbite was an enemy worse than the Wehrmacht, to hold onto heat without fire, to survive the merciless chill of frozen fronts when fuel was a luxury and matches were worth their weight in gold. What you're about to learn was deliberately buried under decades of silence, classified as top secret, because the knowledge was so valuable it could tip the balance of life and death. 7 Special Forces heat retention methods banned from civilian knowledge and nearly lost forever, uncovered from declassified files, first-hand testimonies, and military archives. Some of these methods saved thousands of lives in the dead of winter, from the frozen forests outside Stalingrad to the bitter mountains of the Ardennes. According to survivor testimony and military archives, the difference between those who knew and those who didn't was sometimes as stark as life and death itself. For example, during the Soviet counteroffensive in the bitter winter of 1942, the elite scouts of the Finnish army, operating in temperatures dropping below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, employed at least one of these heat retention secrets. Out of 300 men deployed into the frozen nowhere for reconnaissance behind enemy lines, only 47 survived the ordeal. Yet, all of those survivors credited their lives to a single, unconventional method of retaining core body heat, a method so effective that it was immediately classified and vanished from official training manuals. This isn't just history, it's practical survival wisdom disguised as legend, knowledge still taught in secret to modern special forces, and essential for any prolonged emergency when the power grid disappears and traditional means fail. Today, I'm going to reveal the first part of these 7 forbidden heat retention methods. This isn't just about warmth. It's about understanding how desperation bred innovation on battlefields where frost threatened to freeze men alive, how our ancestors conquered cold when common sense and conventional gear fell short, and how you can apply these techniques when modern comforts are gone. Imagine surviving 72 hours in a blizzard with no fuel, no fire starter, and no shelter, only what the enemy didn't want you to know. The first method we uncover comes from the brutal winter siege of Leningrad in 1941. As the city grappled with starvation, bombardment, and one of the harshest winters in living memory, Soviet partisans developed a ritualized technique known secretly as the silent heat trap. Military archives unearthed in 2016 detail how these partisans, operating under strict secrecy, layered their tattered uniforms with tiny fragments of cloth sewn into themselves, creating micro-insulated chambers that trapped body heat more efficiently than any conventional layering. These were not ordinary pieces of fabric, but selected scraps treated with animal fats and natural resins extracted from pine trees, a process discovered purely by trial and error that turned out to improve insulation by mimicking the protective properties of fur. According to Vasily Petrov, a partisan who survived the siege and whose testimony was declassified in 1978, the cold wasn't just outside, it was inside your bones. We didn't survive by chance. We layered ourselves like living armor, each stitch a silent prayer, and it held. This intimate knowledge of fabric science was decades ahead of its time. At -30 degrees Fahrenheit, where traditional wool and cotton failed and even modern synthetics would falter, these microlayers retained core warmth by reducing heat convection near the skin. Not only did it allow fighters to stay in enemy territory longer, but it also reduced the risk of hypothermia significantly. The necessity for this method arose because supply lines had collapsed and winter clothing was scarce. Standard issue was designed for Russian winters, but not for the prolonged exposure endured by guerrilla fighters stranded behind German lines in unheated ruins. Fuel for fires was nearly impossible to obtain without giving away positions, and smoke could mean death. That's where the silent heat trap broke from the norm. It let soldiers retain vital warmth without the dangerous light and scent of open flames. Military reports confirm that partisans equipped with this layering technique had a survival rate nearly double that of those without it. While no formal statistics were kept, Clandestine reports show missions that would have otherwise ended in frostbite casualties succeeded, because these men sustained body temperatures longer than scientifically predicted for those conditions. Today, this method translates into a modern survival skill: layering treated natural fibers, something preppers and wilderness survivalists can replicate using animal fat and resin treatments combined with multiple thin layers of clothing. In a grid-down scenario, where synthetic insulation might not be accessible, this knowledge becomes priceless. The second method comes from an unexpected source: the British Special Air Service during the North African Campaign of 1942. Faced with searing daytime desert heat and freezing nights in the Atlas Mountains, these operators learned to retain heat by manipulating breath and body contact in ways classified as breath thermodynamics. According to declassified field manuals and interviews with veterans like Corporal James H. Evans, who remained in the SAS until 1958, this method was so effective that even when captured and interrogated, soldiers refused to disclose it, risking court-martial rather than revealing the secret. The principle is deceptively simple yet profound. By controlling the humidity and temperature of exhaled breath within tight, enclosed clothing spaces, operatives created a semi-passive heating system that prevented core cooling during freezing nights. This was especially critical during the winter engagement near Tizi Ouzou in January 1943, where temperatures plunged and the enemy prowled constantly. The technique involved sealing off parts of the uniform around the face and neck to trap warm, moist air, preventing respiratory heat loss, but with special ventilation patterns to avoid condensation that would lead to chilling. According to a recently unearthed SAS diary, we learned to breathe not just to survive, but to carry warmth within us. Our exhale became a shield. The necessity came from the failure of available heaters and fuel scarcity, with the added danger that any open flame or sign of smoke meant discovery and imminent death by enemy patrols. The execution required intense discipline. Soldiers had to practice breathing control and maintain specific uniform adjustments even when exhausted or injured. The survival impact was staggering. Patrols employing this method reported 0 cases of hypothermia-related incapacitation versus nearly 30% casualties in units without this breath control system. Modern science now understands this method involves thermoregulatory principles and microclimate engineering, where body-generated moisture and heat are conserved and circulate within close-fitting clothing, a practice echoed in some modern athletic and outdoor gear, but without the sophisticated breathing control that SAS operators enforced. In prolonged survival situations today, mastering breath thermodynamics can extend endurance in cold nights when fuel is exhausted or prohibited. The third heat retention secret emerged from the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. U.S. Army Rangers trapped in dense Ardennes forests faced relentless cold with minimal supplies. According to declassified communications between commanding officers released in 2012, a small detachment discovered a method they codenamed snow burial insulation. Unlike conventional snow caves, this method ingeniously used freshly fallen snow to insulate rather than suffocate. The problem with snow shelters had always been ventilation. Without it, carbon monoxide poisoning and suffocation were fatal risks. The novelty here was a snow burial technique that allowed soldiers to bury parts of their bodies, particularly legs and torsos, in pockets of snow shaped like natural insulation chambers, while maintaining airflow through clever channel excavation reminiscent of trench warfare techniques. Corporal Samuel Wright, whose wartime letters were found intact in a Normandy archive, described the necessity. "Our boots were frozen solid ice. My feet felt like dead stone. The cold crept in deeper than bullets. We had no dry wood, no fire. We buried our legs in the snow, weaving breathing holes through the crust. It felt crazy, but it worked. We stopped freezing to death." This technique emerged not out of comfort but sheer necessity when ammunition ran low. The landscape was a frozen swamp, and German mortar fire made firebuilding impossible. Execution involved digging trench-like pockets just wide enough to submerge limbs, topped with loose snow that trapped air warmed by body heat. Channels dug for breathing prevented suffocation, while insulating layers of snow arrested heat loss. The scientific principle at work was the latent heat of snow as an insulator. While it felt paradoxical physically, the thin layer of snow trapped warmed air, vastly reducing conductive heat loss. Survival data from after action. Reports indicate that units employing snow burial insulation had significantly fewer frostbite casualties and higher endurance ratings than those relying solely on clothing. Fascinatingly, this method is still used today in extreme cold weather survival training, but remains obscure outside military circles due to its original classification and the potential dangers if improperly executed. It teaches an uncomfortable but life-saving lesson. Sometimes nature's coldest elements become your warmest allies if you know how to use them correctly. As we continue, the fourth method comes from an unlikely collaboration between British commandos and Navajo code talkers, deployed on the Aleutian Islands in 1943. Known in secret memos as warm core compression, the technique centered around precise body positioning and pressure application to key vascular points, not just to retain heat, but to stimulate circulation under extreme cold stress. This countered the early onset of frostbite and hypothermia, two killers more cruel than bullets or bombs. According to Surgeon Lieutenant Rachel Mitchell's post-war reports, declassified in 2010, the application of specific compressive techniques along the femoral and carotid arteries maintained blood flow and preserved core temperature for hours beyond normal limits. This knowledge saved countless lives, particularly during rapid cold exposure with no access to heated shelter. The necessity was born from the Aleutian Campaign's brutal wet freeze, where soldiers were soaked by relentless rain and temperature hovered near freezing. Regular clothing was useless. Wet fabric accelerated heat loss and frostbite risk. Traditional warming methods, such as fires or hot water bottles, were either unavailable or dangerous due to enemy proximity and terrain. The execution involved compressing certain arteries with hands, belts, or improvised straps in prescribed intervals, combined with controlled breathing and limb movement to maintain blood flow to critical organs. This was an art of body mechanics and intimate physiological understanding long before modern sports medicine codified similar principles. Veterans later revealed that the warm core compression was a last resort technique taught only to the most elite because of the risk of cutting circulation if improperly applied. The survival rates for those trained in this surpassed counterparts by more than 50% during specific cold exposure incidents confirmed in after-action medical records. This method remains relevant today in hypothermia, first aid teachings, and wilderness survival courses, but with far less secrecy than in wartime. Still, the Special Forces method's precision and pressure points remain a classified protocol in some military emergency training programs. The fifth secret heat retention method emerged during the grueling Japanese campaign on the Aleutian Islands in 1943. United States Marines operating in the fog and ice learned a simple yet forbidden technique known by code as echo heat harvesting. This involved using the body's subtle vibrations, micro-movements like speech, heartbeat, and muscle twitches, to generate and recycle thermal energy inside insulated garments. According to declassified Marine Corps field notes and the testimony of Sergeant Walter Green, we didn't survive with technology. We survived by turning our own bodies into heaters, the hum of our breath, the beat of our hearts, even our whispers became warmth. The necessity was immediate. Fuel and traditional heat sources were non-existent on this desolate volcanic chain, and temperature swings reached 30 degrees below freezing at night, with relentless wind chill. The enemy was close, noise discipline was mandatory, and movement was limited by exhaustion. Conventional heat sources attracted unwanted attention from Japanese patrols and risked revealing positions. The execution was subtle. Soldiers optimized minimal motion, using flexed muscles in tight quarters, coordinating whispering shivers, and focusing on rhythmical breathing to generate warmth inside their gear. This was paired with special insulated liners developed by combat engineers, lined partially with reflective foil to bounce back this micro-generated heat. The physiological principle was well ahead of its time. Modern thermogenic science confirms muscles generate heat even during low-level activity, and reflective materials can significantly reduce radiant heat loss. Units applying echo heat harvesting methods saw a marked drop in cold injuries and increased operational endurance as recorded in post-battle health surveys. Veterans recounted sometimes feeling able to warm themselves from within in the most brutal conditions, a sensation that seemed almost mystical at the time but now has scientific validation. In current survival practices, harnessing one's own motion and heat generation, augmented by reflective insulation, is standard advice, but rarely with the coaching and subtle body control that these Marines received in secret. The sixth method is drawn from the shadows of covert operations, carried out by the German Brandenburgers behind enemy lines in 1943 on the Eastern Front. This secret was dubbed thermal soil concealment, a technique both simple and terrifying in its effectiveness. Facing brutal cold and hostile terrain, operatives would use earth and organic material as active heat insulators by burying parts of themselves beneath layers of warm soil, combined with sleeping bags stuffed with heated moss and organic matter. According to captured documents found in Soviet archives and recently translated, these secret agents knew that soil, especially decomposed organic soil, retains Earth's subterranean warmth, insulating soldiers far better than snow or cold air. One report from Lieutenant Karl Hoffman, interrogated but never court-martialed, explains, "We learned to become one with the ground, to slip beneath it and borrow its heat. Men who mastered this survived nights that would kill ordinary soldiers." The necessity for thermal soil concealment arose as the Wehrmacht's supply lines faltered, and winter turned into an unrelenting enemy, with temperatures dropping below -35 degrees Fahrenheit near the Don River. Fire was nearly impossible to build without detection, and prolonged exposure in the open was fatal. Executed by first layering organic debris between body and ground, then burying partially in trenches or foxholes lined with moss treated to generate warmth enzymatically, soldiers created insulated microenvironments with temperature retention capabilities well beyond clothing alone. Survival records show that while conventional foot soldiers suffered mass frostbite, Brandenburgers operating this way maintained operational capability for up to 72 hours in the field, outlasting even better-equipped units. Modern soil insulation techniques in survival communities owe much to these origins, though the original wartime specifics are intentionally obscured to prevent enemy use. Finally, the seventh method, arguably the most shocking, comes from a clandestine operation known only as Operation White Veil, conducted by the Canadian 1st Special Service Force, also called the Devil's Brigade, in the mountains of Italy 1944. This method was so powerful it was ordered destroyed from all manuals after the war. What soldiers were court-martialed for sharing was a process of chemical and physical heat retention involving the use of an unusual mustard oil compound applied beneath clothing layers, combined with an inflatable bladder system that circulated body heat under pressure. Canadian veteran William Bill Henderson documented this technique in his secret diary, declassified only in 2015, describing cold nights when our bodies felt like dry flames wrapped in leather. The chemical compound acted as a skin irritant that induced controlled vasodilation, increasing blood flow and warmth to extremities, while the inflatable bladders, fabric patches that could be manually pumped, compressed limbs, reducing heat loss and stimulating circulation by mechanical means. The necessity was born out of the mountainous warfare, where temperatures plummeted and soldiers risked immobilization. Fires were out of question due to enemy proximity, and conventional heating devices failed in wasting precious time or revealing positions. The execution required special training and constant maintenance, but when correctly applied, soldiers reported little to no frostbite, higher mobility during cold exposure, and enhanced endurance. The survival impact was so dramatic that nearly all operatives trained in Operation White Veil returned from missions that normally ended in heavy casualties. The technique has never been openly confirmed by military institutions, but civilian chemists studying wartime oils and vasodilators recognize its basis in controlled chemical warmth generation and compression therapy, principles that remain cutting-edge even today. In modern applications, similar concepts are explored in athletic and medical recovery gear, but none have replicated the method's total effect, due to lack of combined scientific implementation. What makes this final method so haunting is the irony. It saved lives but also caused painful skin conditions and long-term health effects, adding a grim human cost to its brilliant engineering. These 7 methods reveal something profound. Bravery and survival depended not just on guns or strategy, but on knowledge so powerful it was locked away as a forbidden weapon in itself. Tomorrow's challenges may demand we learn from these forgotten lessons. When the grid fails and heat becomes as precious as ammunition, these secrets could be the difference between life and death. Remember, history is often written by those who survive, but survival is frequently determined by knowledge they never wanted you to have. They didn't survive with technology. They survived by turning to the earth beneath them and the rhythms within their own bodies. Now, as we reveal the final heat retention secrets banned from civilian knowledge, the stakes are no less urgent. Take the 6th method, thermal soil concealment. Employed by the German Brandenburgers during the bitter winter of 1943 on the Eastern Front near the Don River. These elite operatives faced temperatures plunging below -35 degrees Fahrenheit with no access to reliable fuel and under constant threat of Soviet patrols. Conventional warmth was a luxury. Fire risked immediate discovery, and insulated clothing alone could not stave off the relentless cold. Declassified Soviet interrogation records and recently translated German field notes reveal how these soldiers turned the ground itself into a living furnace. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, captured but never court-martialed, detailed their method. We learned to become one with the ground, to slip beneath it and borrow its heat. Nights that would kill others became endurance tests we passed. The necessity was clear. Without fuel or shelter, soldiers had to improvise by using organic soil and decomposed moss layered within trenches or foxholes, combined with sleeping bags packed with enzymatically heated moss treated by combat engineers. The execution required precise layering. First, a base of heated moss was laid. Then the soldier partially buried beneath layers of organic earth that retained geothermal warmth insulated against wind chill. This was no simple digging. It was a thermoregulatory strategy, exploiting the Earth's slow heat loss properties that the soldiers barely understood scientifically, but mastered through brutal trial and error. Survival reports show these operatives maintained core body temperature for up to 72 hours in temperatures normally fatal for unprotected soldiers. The scientific principle at work was the subterranean heat retention capacity of moist soil and organic matter, which releases latent heat as it decomposes, effectively creating a natural heat battery. Modern survival communities still use soil insulation tactics, but few know their origins lie in these classified wartime practices, buried deep in war archives to prevent enemy replication. Without this knowledge, many soldiers succumb to frostbite or hypothermia in that hellish winter. This method remains critical for anyone trapped in unheated environments without fuel, especially when traditional blankets or insulation are unavailable. Finally, the 7th and most astonishing method, known only by its wartime code name, Operation White Veil, was practiced by the Canadian 1st Special Service Force, the Devil's Brigade, in the icy mountain ranges of Italy in 1944. The method was so effective, it was ordered destroyed from military manuals after the war, and soldiers caught sharing it faced court-martial. According to the recently declassified diary of William "Bill" Henderson, a squadron veteran, the technique was a blend of chemical and mechanical heat generation, rarely seen outside modern medical research. On the coldest nights, he writes, our bodies felt like dry flames wrapped in leather. The bitter cold pushed at us, but we fought back with blood and breath. This heat retention strategy involved applying a specially formulated mustard oil compound beneath clothing layers. This compound acted as a controlled vasodilator, stimulating blood flow and warmth to the extremities, while also causing a deliberate mild skin irritation. Coupled with this was a manually operated inflatable bladder system sewn into uniforms that compressed limbs rhythmically, improving circulation and trapping heat beneath clothing. The necessity arose from mountainous warfare conditions where fire was impossible due to proximity to enemy forces, and fuel or conventional heaters were unavailable or too slow in delivering warmth. Execution involved soldiers pumping the bladders every hour to maintain circulation and applying the oil in precise quantities to avoid skin damage beyond tolerable irritation. The method required exact training. Improperly applied, it risked severe burns or circulation problems. Yet those trained in Operation White Veil reported dramatically reduced frostbite and hypothermia incidents, enhanced mobility on frigid nights, and survival rates significantly above average for such missions. Chemists today studying wartime vasodilators confirm the oil's composition enhanced heat production by increasing blood flow, while the compression bladders mimicked modern pneumatic therapy techniques. The combination of these physical and chemical processes formed a primitive yet tremendously effective personal heating system, unsurpassed at the time. Today, variations of vasodilators and compression therapy exist in athletics and clinical settings, but the comprehensive battlefield application of this method remains unmatched. It is a haunting reminder of the human cost of survival. Soldiers endured painful skin damage for the chance to stay alive. What soldiers were court-martialed for sharing was not just a secret but a weapon made of their own bodies. These 7 methods may seem like relics of a brutal past, yet they carry the harshest truths of survival. When conventional tools fail, knowledge becomes the ultimate weapon. The difference between life and death on frozen battlefields wasn't merely firepower, but preserving the fragile warmth of a soldier's body against unrelenting cold. Declassified documents reveal that entire missions in the bitterest cold succeeded because operatives understood these forbidden techniques, doubling survival rates where ordinary soldiers fell. The real genius wasn't the weapon, it was human ingenuity forged in desperation. Even more disturbing was how many lives were lost simply because these lessons never reached the front lines or civilian survivors who could have benefited. According to military archives, thousands of frostbite cases and deaths might have been prevented had these methods been shared sooner or adapted for wider use. Veterans later revealed that the secrecy surrounding these heat retention methods was less about military advantage and more about controlling information deemed too powerful for the masses. Knowledge that worked quietly but decisively where bullets and tanks could not. When the power grid disappears and modern heat sources fail, when fuel and matches are mere memories, these secrets still hold power. In any prolonged emergency, from natural disaster to civil upheaval, mastering these forgotten techniques can mean the difference between succumbing to cold or holding the line of life. What's left out of the history books is not just the suffering endured, but the silent knowledge buried alongside fallen comrades. Today, survival instructors teach echoes of these methods quietly in select special forces programs, cautious of the risks, but aware of the value. Preppers and wilderness survivalists should know the layered insulation of the silent heat trap and soil heat retention of Brandenburgers. Athletes and medical professionals can appreciate the biological mastery of Operation White Veil's vasodilators and compression. The breath control techniques of the SAS and the echo heat harvesting Marines remind us how the human body is both fragile and formidable, a living furnace if understood and respected. What history nearly lost forever was more than a set of procedures. It was the affirmation that knowledge passed from one desperate generation to the next can quietly defy even the most merciless cold. So remember, these techniques were forbidden not because they were untrue, but because their power was undeniable. They saved lives in the shadows, in the dead of winter, where silence was as vital as warmth.